operations. During months of interrogation, she revealed details about bin Laden's daily routines, his health problems, and his increasing paranoia in his final years. She described a man who had become obsessed with his own security, rarely leaving his third-floor quarters and spending hours watching news coverage of himself on a small television. She spoke of sleepless nights when he would pace the floors, convinced that betrayal was imminent. These weren't the actions of a confident leader. They were the behaviors of a man living in constant fear. Khairia Sabar's story proved even more complex. Intelligence officials discovered that she had been attempting to leave Pakistan for months before the raid. She had grown disillusioned with the isolated life and had been making inquiries about returning to her native Saudi Arabia. Pakistani authorities found evidence of correspondence between her and family members in the kingdom, suggesting that she had been planning an escape route. The eldest wife, Siham, presented a different challenge entirely. She had been with bin Laden the longest and possessed the most comprehensive knowledge of his network's operations. During interrogation, she provided information about safe houses, communication methods, and financial channels that had been used throughout the previous decade. But here's what makes this even more disturbing: the conditions of their detention. The 3 women and their children were held in a safe house in Islamabad under constant surveillance. They were not allowed legal representation for months, and their families had no knowledge of their whereabouts. International human rights organizations would later condemn these conditions, but by then, the damage was done. The psychological impact on the children during this period cannot be overstated. They witnessed their mothers being questioned repeatedly, lived under constant guard, and had no contact with the outside world. Some of the younger children began exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress. In March 2012, Pakistani authorities made a decision that would scatter the bin Laden family across the globe. After nearly a year in custody, the wives and children were to be deported to their countries of origin. But this presented an unprecedented diplomatic challenge. Saudi Arabia, despite being the homeland of bin Laden and several family members, initially refused to accept the returnees. The kingdom's position was clear. They did not want to deal with the international scrutiny and potential security risks that would come with harboring bin Laden's immediate family. Yemen, Amal al-Sada's home country, was in the midst of its own political upheaval. The government was barely functioning, and the last thing they needed was the international attention that would come with accepting bin Laden's youngest wife and her children. For weeks, diplomatic negotiations continued behind closed doors. The solution, when it finally came, satisfied no one. Amal and her children would be sent to Yemen, while the other wives and their children would be deported to Saudi Arabia. But the Saudi government imposed strict conditions. The family members would be placed under house arrest indefinitely, with no freedom of movement and no contact with media. The deportation itself was conducted under extraordinary security measures. Multiple flights were arranged, with different family members traveling on separate aircraft to prevent any coordinated media attention. Pakistani authorities provided false documentation to some family members to facilitate their departure. But here's where the story becomes even more troubling. Some of the older children, particularly those over 16, were given a choice. They could remain in Pakistan and potentially seek asylum elsewhere, or accompany their mothers to uncertain futures in Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Several chose to stay behind, creating permanent family separations that continue to this day. The youngest children, some barely old enough to understand what was happening, were essentially stateless during this period. They held no valid passports, had no legal status in Pakistan, and were being sent to countries where their futures remained completely uncertain. International observers noted that these deportations violated several international treaties regarding the treatment of children and refugees. But geopolitical considerations trumped legal obligations. The family members who arrived in Saudi Arabia found themselves in a gilded prison. They were housed in a compound in Jeddah, provided with basic necessities, but stripped of fundamental freedoms. This wasn't the homecoming they had imagined. Khairia Sabar, despite being a Saudi citizen, discovered that her citizenship provided no protection. She was placed under surveillance that monitored her every movement, every conversation, every contact,